Buenas tardes, buena tarde. Y de nuevo, gracias por venir, a pesar de los accidentes y del viento. Bueno, pues llegamos a la tercera sesión de este ciclo sobre ibéricos y jamones, que son el segundo y último estudio portugués, Atelier local, que no son de... Estamos muy acostumbrados a hablar de Oporto y Lisboa, y no son ni de Oporto y Lisboa, son de Valongo, que es área metropolitana de Oporto, pero no es Oporto. Y bueno, aquí está João Paupério y Maria Rebelo. Muchas gracias por venir. Y para presentar, como yo aquí me retiro, pues tengo a Miquel Ruiz de H3O, de Estudio H3O, que siempre hago esta cosa de que hay alguien local que lo presenta. Así que, Miquel.
Muchas gracias. Bueno, voy a presentar en castellano, porque si no, Joao y María no me van a entender del todo. Primero de todo, agradecerte, Moisés, pues dar continuidad al ciclo de Europa a Europa con este formato que es Jamón Jamón, que bueno, pone en común prácticas relevantes, ¿no?, del contexto de la península ibérica. Justo antes estaba hablando con Joan y me decía, hay un concepto que es bonito, que es el de Iberia, que es que justo por debajo de los Pirineos todo lo que sucede, pues de alguna manera nos une, ¿no? Y entonces tiene mucho sentido el nombre de este ciclo, que es Jamón Jamón, y que justo Joao me decía que también hay jamón en Portugal. Bueno, pues hoy tenemos entre nosotros a Atelier local, que bueno, es esta práctica formada por João Paupério y Maria Rebelo. Los dos se formaron en la Universidad de Porto y bueno, es una universidad que todos conocemos pues por su rigor constructivo, por su relación con el lugar, y justo hablando con João me decía, sí, es verdad que nosotros hemos heredado todo esto de la universidad, pero también lo hemos puesto en crisis en nuestra arquitectura. Es decir, hay una continuidad, pero hay una continuidad crítica con esto que habéis aprendido en la Facultad de Oporto, que a la vez ha formado pues cantidad de arquitectos súper rigurosos, ¿no? Luego también es muy importante saber que entre el 2015 y el 2018, los dos, ambos, que se conocieron en la escuela, pero realmente se conocieron en la universidad y fue cuando empezaron a salir juntos. Bueno, pues aquí se fueron de Erasmus juntos a Bruselas y en Bruselas se quedaron 3 años y se quedaron en el estudio de Baukunst. Claro, esto también los caracteriza y de algún modo pues lo relaciona con todo un contexto de gente con mucha energía que sale de su país, que se impregna de ideas internacionales y que, sin embargo, decide volver a su realidad cotidiana, ¿no?, a su lugar de origen, que esto es una decisión muy consciente, el hecho de volver, como decías, Moisés, a Valongo. Esto demuestra una posición que también determina el nombre de la práctica, que es local, ¿no? También, bueno, local es una palabra que pues, nos remite a cercanía, a enraizamiento, a materiales cercanos, a economías de la construcción. Pero también hablando con Joao me comentó que hay más complejidad detrás de este nombre. O sea, para ellos también demuestra una condición anónima de todas esas cosas que forman parte del sustrato cotidiano y que no necesariamente son conocidas. Y luego también hay como esta, no sé cómo decir, esta anécdota de que local surgió cuando estabais en Baukunst y un chico, de una forma un poco peyorativa, les dijo, pero vosotros sois locales, ¿no? Porque no habéis viajado. Y dijeron, bueno, pues está muy bien que cojamos esta palabra y le demos un giro y la positivemos, porque ser local hoy en día no quiere decir no haber viajado. Hay muchas maneras de ver el mundo, ¿no?, hoy en día. Y nada, si seguimos y pensamos en cómo trabajan ellos, pues evidentemente después de 3 años en Baukunst aprendieron muchísimas cosas y una que caracteriza su práctica y su manera de hacer es la memoria del gesto. O sea, yo me comentaba que en Baukunst impulsivamente hacían maquetas y las repetían y las repetían y las repetían. Y era como 20 veces haciendo lo mismo para encontrar la perfección, ¿no? Y claro, heredas un gesto, heredas una manera de trabajar, un mecanismo, ¿no?, que está detrás de las manos propiamente y que ya es casi autómata. Entonces, diríamos que su arquitectura ha heredado esta memoria del gesto de Baukunst y que también hay una cierta libertad geométrica, que bueno, veremos hoy en sus proyectos, que también remite a prácticas muy relevantes como Bilderbing-Taller, que es una de vuestras prácticas más, digamos, queridas. Entonces, en esta manera de trabajar, que demuestra una actitud constante, también porque se mezcla pues, la vida privada con la vida profesional, hay una lectura muy consciente de las preexistencias, ¿no? Una manera de intervenir en el lugar sin borrar, entendiendo realmente lo que es preexistente. Y esto les lleva no solo a construir, sino también a reflexionar y a pensar antes de hacer un proyecto. Esta reflexión les lleva a una investigación que viene por una lectura, ¿no? Una lectura no solo arquitectónica, sino también textual de textos. Y esto les ha impulsado a ellos dos a también empezar una línea, pues, digamos, editorial y teórica, reflejándose también en unos arquitectos que son referentes para ellos, que son Allison y Peter Smithson. En este sentido han coeditado libros, hay un librito por aquí que, bueno, si queréis luego os lo podemos enseñar, que es de sus 5 años de práctica y es acerca de sus pensamientos sobre su propia práctica, pero ahora también están haciendo pues toda una serie de reflexiones sobre prácticas amigas, o sea, reflexiones acerca de otros, entre los cuales está Fala, Baukunst, Lacaton y Basal, entre otros, y que este librito pues, se publicará próximamente, supongo, no sé cuándo. Y nada, o sea, han recibido varios premios, pero bueno, mencionar que fueron finalistas, a mí eso me gusta, en Arquía Próxima, cuando estaba Marina Otero como curator, porque eso realmente les posiciona como una práctica relevante, emergente y con un posicionamiento crítico. Y en ese sentido creo que también es relevante, pues porque en un contexto de crisis ecológica, modelos de construcción que todo el rato pues, están en revisión y en un momento de saturación de imágenes, ellos proponen hacer menos pero hacerlo mejor. Es una práctica atenta, situada y responsable. Es una práctica que es un proceso de conocimiento previo a través del texto y del pensar, pero también de autoconocimiento de la propia práctica. Y por último, quería decir que nosotros estamos inmersos aquí en Cataluña en un sistema de concursos que nos ha hecho construir estudios a través de la ilusión de pensar que podemos trabajar por un cliente que es el sector público. Y esto se puede, pero es un sacrificio ingente, que sin embargo, hablando con João, descubrí que no porto es no ingente, sino prácticamente imposible. Y es por este motivo que el esfuerzo hacia lo público es prácticamente destructivo para las prácticas jóvenes emergentes, que Atelier local se ha enfocado sobre todo en la tipología de la casa, en la escala doméstica. Y esto es, creo, lo que nos van a contar hoy.
So, hola a todos y todas. First of all, I'm sorry, I'm going to speak in English. Actually, I'm going to read in English, Maria as well. And we are going to do that mostly for two reasons, because when we speak, we tend to speak too much. And also because every time we do a lecture, we like to take it as a pretext, an opportunity to reflect furthermore and to be precise about what we want to say. So first of all, of course, I would like to thank the Centro Roberto de Arquitectura and Moises Puente for the invitation. And it's very important for us to be here among names of offices we tend to follow and with whom we tend to establish a dialogue, even if it's sometimes silent. Of course, I would like also to thank Miguel. We always learn a lot when we listen to someone else talk about our work. It tends to look more interesting than it actually is. So today we title our lecture, for instance, a house, which in Spanish would be something like, por ejemplo, una casa. And we chose it because of a recent conversation we had with a colleague where he kind of criticized our work, accusing it, in his own words, of never going beyond the scale of the house, while his larger work was more political, he said. But we also named it like that because of a book we bought to our baby daughter not so long ago with the title, for instance, A Rose. It's a marvelous illustration book about words, names, and their meanings, and about what we can or cannot do with them. Words, it is written in that book, designate everything that exists and has existed, everything we imagine, and also things that seem not to exist because we cannot yet see, hear, or smell them. To a certain extent, the word house designates every single house that exists and has existed before, but it also designates all those houses that we cannot yet see, hear, or smell, that don't necessarily fit all those images and feelings of home that we have collected before and so far, but that we can still imagine and thereby transform the word house into new meanings through a new distribution of the sensible, to use an expression by Jacques Rancière that we appreciate a lot. Perhaps this is why we do not seem to get bored of working with houses, mostly the renovated, that is, working with the smaller architecture of the house, but also why we believe that even without leaving the domestic sphere, our work may very well be considered political, by questioning who has access to conceive and experience it, what, how, and why not otherwise. So let's start. As we come from Porto, a place where context is known to be determinant for one's understanding of architecture, let's start there. To really understand our trajectory and probably the work we are about to share, it's important to consider the context we have been working in. We started studying architecture in 2009, shortly after the global financial crisis of 2008. This meant that we were studying under the prospect of graduating into a profession with no jobs. The real estate and construction sectors had collapsed, leaving architecture offices in Portugal with little or no work. After the first austerity shockwave, policies shifts the Portuguese economy towards massive investments in tourism, dramatically leading to the gentrification of Portuguese cities. Rather than addressing the housing crisis, the real estate market was reset with a focus on property as a financial asset rather than a basic need. Of course, housing prices skyrocketed, and people were increasingly pushed out, forced to search for homes further and further away from the city center. We founded our studio 10 years later, in 2019. That was just before the COVID pandemic, the ongoing war in Ukraine, and even a blockage of the Suez Canal, if you can remember. Together, these events once again exposed capitalism's nature as a never-ending cycle of crisis, as they contributed to historic levels of inflation in construction costs. This, of course, further reduced what we and our clients could realistically afford. At the same time, we were confronted with the growing and undeniable evidence of the climate emergency, which has become increasingly public and pressing in recent years. And with that came a clearer understanding of construction's significant role in that crisis. we came to realize that reduction should no longer be viewed as an ideological stance in favor of minimalism, but as a material necessity. Our present, we believe, is no longer one where we can imagine doing more with less. Less is not more. Less is simply less, but mostly enough. And at this point, we believe it is the only way forward. These are the circumstances we've been working under, and not just us, but most Portuguese architects of our generation, who, working with precarious commissions and precarious conditions, have somehow managed to carve out space for architecture in the midst of all these overlapping crises. This is why, together with Fala and Francisco Ascensão, we recently carried out a survey of some of those practices. We call it "This is not a portrait." Partially because we never intended it to be a portrait of an entire Portuguese generation, but rather an inventory of different responses to a shared historical context. And also because it wasn't meant to be about architects themselves, but about architectures and the architectural ecology they have helped to shape. Inside, there are no names and no descriptions, no explanation on why images are paired the way they are, only a set of buildings designed by young architects who were trained during the financial crisis, who in many cases had to emigrate in search of work, and having somewhat been detached from their original context, seemed ironically to be in a better position to interpret this moment than many of their older peers. A generation learned to find ways, less expensive in financial terms, but not in spatial quality, to operate within a fragmented and peripheral territory. Of course, we weren't only interested in what we had been doing or how we had been doing it, but also why we had been doing it in a certain way. That's why, in parallel, we decided to write a book about our first 5 years of practice. As materialists, we believe that our consciousness is shaped more by the reality we live in than the other way around. So we felt it was urgent to understand from the start our way of thinking was being shaped by our concrete day-to-day experience. It didn't take long to realize that most of our conclusions had already been reached by someone else. So in this book, you will find pictures of our work side by side with quotations by others. Not because we had those quotes in mind while we were designing those buildings, but because those words seemed to express far better than we ever could what we were actually dealing with at the time. Like, for instance, Venturi Scott Brown and Eisenhower claiming that learning from the existing landscape is a way of being revolutionary for an architect. Of course, not the obvious way, which would be to tear down Paris and begin again, like Le Corbusier suggested in the 20s, but another, more tolerant way that is to question how we look at things. Or Hammercheck defending that architecture is not a matter of erecting a world on the basis of a plan. We have at hand a powerful built mass on which we can only make minor additions to change, estrange, reinterpret, and perhaps regulate it. Or yet, Allison and Peter Smithson presenting the has found as a way to do it, where the art is in the picking up, turning over, and putting with, and the found where the art is in the process and the watchful eye. All of this pointing towards a way of looking at our work that is perhaps less heroic, but for us, far more promising. Like in this small refurbishment project, consisting in opening 2 new windows into an otherwise nicely proportioned house, and giving a renewed presence in the neighborhood by picking a confident color, chosen during a stroll with the clients through the nearby social housing blocks. Or this recent scenography for a museum in Porto, which we designed together with our friends Rita Araújo and Pedro Dionísio, where practically all the elements you see in the image, such as the thick walls, the plinth, or the display cases, were reused from the museum's own inventory, simply painted and rearranged in new ways. Or else those that could not be painted, due to the fact that they were designed by Fernando Távora, hidden under some new mirror skirts, producing unexpected effects in an otherwise untouched ceiling.
So, The first project we would like to present in detail is our own studio house, which is actually the refurbishment of a 2-century-old house in Valongo, a town known for having historically produced most bread for the city of Porto up to the 19th century. A peripheral city where one finds an endless sea of banal forms of housing, factories and warehouses, landfills and rubbish dumps, farming fields and orchards, and all types of spaces, where places have been altered and extended with no single plan, existing in between light and shadow, interiors and exteriors, but also between privacy and publicity, between the bedroom and the workroom, where houses may very well be factories too. This house belonged to João's family, and it had been a bakery house, a common mixed topology back in the days. We had very little money, and we were very conditioned by the norms and regulations in place, which could be subverted in our favor if the envelope was kept intact. This forced us to recognize the qualities of the existing house, ultimately embracing not to as a methodological point of departure. Once we started working on it, we realized that the large spans of the timber structure suggested the house had once been much more open than the small enclosed rooms we had found when we started. So we began by demolishing what we believed to be superfluous to the original character of the house. And as we did that, we started uncovering structure and space, a huge amount of empty volume that simply wasn't being used, even above a rather low false ceiling. In some cases, we realized we could simply move and reuse certain elements as ready-mades, or left some found materials like granite or slate exposed. And in doing so, we began using the space even before the project was fully finished, which confirmed for us that it would be absurd to redivide such a generous space. Robin Evans wrote, "The search for privacy, comfort, and independence through the agency of architecture is quite recent, and even when these words first came into play and were used in relation to household affairs, their meaning were quite different from those we now understand. A couple images came to mind, like this room in a provincial Italian house, which is unclear whether the space is interior or exterior, or even its precise function. Or, on the right, a bedroom in a 17th century Flemish house, where the arrangement on the table seems to suggest that meals were taken in the very same space where someone sleeps, tucked inside a hidden alcove. After all, the as found speaks not only to what we literally discover on site, but also to the other places we have been able to collect within our own imagination. This allowed us to drop many of the usual conventions about what a house should be. We decided to add just the bare minimum infrastructure to make it livable again. 2 hyperfunctional sculptures, a bathroom and a kitchen counter, organizing a field of useless spaces open for imagination, the distance between things being what regulates privacy inside the house for its many users. And you can see here in the drawings, the yellow marks are for the few demolitions and the red shows the few additions. The bedroom pieces organize the studio space where we work. Here seen from the street-facing window on the left. Here, the entrance hall, which is our daughter's favorite football field. Of course, since the budget was tight, we decided to experiment with cheap materials that aren't usually meant to be exposed. Things like water-resistant MDF, OSB panels, or this kind of cement floor. Used for their aesthetic qualities, but also to address the absurd inflation we already were facing at that time. The piece of the bathroom is also a light well and a staircase providing access to the house's former piano nobile. Here, a few flashes from Francisco Ascensão, where you can see the intersection and ambiguity between old and new elements. and the piano nobile with a big room and 2 sleeping alcoves. As a generous space, it was thought to keep many possible uses. We added internal wood frames for thermal and acoustic comfort, and naturally the roof and walls were insulated, but the structure was reused whenever possible, with a few elements replaced as they were damaged due to rainwater infiltration. On the other side of the house, separated by a thick wall, you find the new mezzanine and the kitchen counter, which organize the main living space of the house, a space to cook, eat, sleep, wherever, whose atmosphere depends on how we use the skylight and the window shutters. Once again, the new piece unfolding as a staircase, giving access to the mezzanine, a more private space for reading and sleeping under the sky, but always with a connection back to the rest of the living space. Floating above it to store the heat from the rest of the house during winter, so it does not need to be heated. In the back facade, where we followed the same approach, speaking a language made from new and old elements on the same phrase, without a clear distinction between the old and the new elements. No intention to mark a clear line between what was there and what was not, where pristine metal pieces and ruins become piers without a clear hierarchy. The second project we would like to share follows the same spirit. It is also a refurbishment of an old house in the same town, sharing certain typological and construction-related similarities. This house, however, is half the size of the previous one, possibly because it was only ever a house, not also a bakery. Unlike the previous one, the interior here were a blank state, no need for any demolition work. And unlike most houses in this town, we found a staircase running parallel to the party wall, rather than to the street, as you would usually expect. Both of these features were results of a previous refurbishment, one that had never been fully completed. Because it was built further up the valley slope, perpendicular to the incline, this house has a very different relationship, both to the street and to the rear garden. Slightly raised above street level, the lower floor opens onto a sunken garden enclosed by slate walls, and the upper level connects both to the valley and to the former agricultural terrace at the back, with an excellent sun exposure. When our clients bought this house, they were not sure what to do with it, except that they would need 2 rooms, one for sleeping and one for working. They gave us plenty of leeway to think about the layout of the house. The main idea behind the design was to transform a rather small house so that it would feel good-sized, but without the need for an extension. We are deeply convinced that it is our task to convince people who hire us to build less and less. The odd position of the staircase prompted us to invert the traditional layout, reimagining the house upside down, compared to a more conventional arrangement for a Portuguese house. This means that the entrance hall is also the bedroom hall, reducing the circulation to a necessary minimum in this small house. This hall, which is slightly elevated from the street, gives access to 3 small rooms, a workroom, a bathroom, and a bathroom, all of them with proper windows. Its eccentric geometry is related to accessible mobility, but also to the will of making it feel larger than it actually is, a feeling that is achieved through its relationship with a mirrored bathroom door and the staircase leading upwards towards a very tall ceiling. Or else through the bathroom and bedroom windows opening onto the luxuriant sunken garden designed by Pomo, a landscape architecture studio in Porto. Upstairs, one finds one single space, transversal and with a very generous ceiling height, more than 4 meters at its highest, making it feel a lot spacier than it actually is. Like in the previous houses, air and light circulate freely between the 2 facades. In it, one finds only 2 pieces of furniture, an infrastructural storage unit with a small hidden toilet and a kitchen. Outside, one finds the wooden terrace resting on concrete columns, allowing direct access from the main room to the upper level of the garden. This type of architecture, based on small everyday gestures, makes us think about the work of an artist named Mierle Laderman-Ukeles. In this slide, you can see a photo of a performance where she cleans up the steps of a museum. With this work, she highlighted the often invisible labor of maintenance that is necessary to keep a space functioning. In our architecture, more often than making great design gestures, we care to engage in these small acts of conservation. In her manifesto for maintenance art, Ukeles includes a text where she states the following: I will simply do these maintenance everyday things, exhibit them as art. I will live in the museum as I customarily do at home with my husband and my baby, and do all these things as public art activities. I will sweep and wax the floors, dust everything, wash the walls, cook, invite people to eat. My working will be the work. Everything I say is art is art. Everything I do is art. We have no art. We try to do everything well. And here, whenever possible, materials were used as found, swept, dusted, and waxed. The wooden structures, the stone walls, the pitched roof, except for a well-maintained wood truss floating the main room, most of the existing wood was painted so that it could be repaired and maintained, where and when needed, but still keeping an uniform appearance. The new terrace and pieces of furniture are made of wood so that they will be light and made by the same workers repairing the structure. For the walls, we mostly recurred to standard plasterboard panels to adapt to the technical capabilities of those we knew would be building the house. It is difficult to reduce a project to a single gesture, but there are 2 that are particularly significant. The first is the curved plasterboard ceiling that reminds us of a tent. Of course, these evoke a certain imaginary, but the truth is that none of these images were in our head. The curves were found on site when construction workers were picking the plasterboards, defying the force of gravity, and they curved the shape of a catenary. The same workers who then took this idea as an artistic challenge and were the first to commit to test and solve on site all the difficult encounters and intersections this curved shape would provoke when meeting a house with a skewed geometry. No rhino, no 3D model needed, just the working class arts. The second gesture is the light timber terrace, allowing direct access from the main room to the upper garden. A rather banal timber frame with a twisted handrail suggested by the carpenter himself. Together, these gestures mean that, although located in the city, the house feels like a simpler holiday home all year round. And here you can see all those gestures at the same time, and the house reflected on a very cheap garden room. The facade features exposed cork. This is a very pragmatic solution in which the insulation and finish of the house are the same. It is very easy to work and apply, and in addition to being produced in Portugal, cork has exceptional thermal properties and allows the house to breathe, preventing condensation inside. We really like this image because if you pay attention, it also almost looks like a Peter the Hook painting, where you can see the garden, from the garden to the valley, through the interior of the house. And a final story about the design process concerns the concrete columns holding the terrace. The octagonal formwork we used to build them were retrieved from another construction of our friends at Atelier. For us, this became a symbol of the as-found attitude extended to new possible means and meanings for method and ecology, taking and reusing existing things and ideas from one project into another. Like in this project we just submitted for planning approval, a studio house for an artist by the Atlantic Ocean, which for periods must be able to work as two separate units. Like in our own studio house, the house becomes two, divided by a thick wall. Its typological deposition arises not from the bourgeois conventions for modern apartments, with a series of more or less equal rooms connected by vestibules and corridors. As a scenography, whose movements are more or less defined a priori, but from the possibilities we learn from the houses we have refurbished, with spaces rather defined by contrasting qualities like big, small, open, closed, bright, dark, high, low, and so on. A sequence of places with different spatial characteristics and degrees of access, where activities of various kinds may take place under the same roof. And you can see here that from these houses we found and transformed, we also learned to appreciate both the spatial and technical advantages of a pitch roof. Through these, like we usually say to each other, that there is no such thing as a flat roof, so we better accept it and take advantage from it. Some drawings from the facades, a section where you can see how the space goes and talks to each other. Or also these other projects for a suburban house, which should start construction in the next couple of months, where you can see that the typology of a rather banal suburban plot is put to text, and its interior space composed primarily from its structural and infrastructural elements, like columns, bathrooms, and technical shafts. The ground floor, or the exterior porch carved out from the existing rocky topography. And with an inverted pitched roof retrieved from the childhood memories of one of the clients, who grew up in a house designed by a modernist Portuguese architect named João Anderson.
So for the next project, we would like to start with a quote by Lina Bobardi. In a way, it explains why we chose the name Atelier Local. I guess if we had to pick one word to describe our methodology, even if we needed one, that word would be collaboration. Not in the neoliberal appropriation through which workers have been replaced by collaborators, as if labor contradictions had already been solved, but in the sense where each of the agents and intervenients in the architectural project hold a specific knowledge, contributing to its success as a collective work of art. This meaning of collaboration as a way to re-envision the architectural project is tightly related to another idea, the idea that we are currently living in a burnout society, to use Byung-Chul Han's formulation. Architectural and construction workers are exhausted. The world itself is becoming exhausted as natural resources are being spent above the capacity to restoration. Collaboration, both with people and existing buildings, is the way we found to reduce the amount of work, energy and matter we spent in design and construction. Indispensable as we are an office of only two, me and Maria. We like it that small, and it is the only way that we can keep it like that. It is the case of this project in Canas de Senhorim that we are currently developing with Francisco Ascensão, Ana Catarina Costa, and José Luís Tavares, which consists in the refurbishment of a complex of old farm buildings in a vast agricultural plot in the countryside in the center of Portugal. This cluster of buildings, named Casa das Sete Senhoras, after a local myth about it being haunted by 7 witches, was actually the starting point for a photography book produced by Tito Moraes, a very well-known Portuguese photographer, who has since bought the land to transform it into its own house, a photography lab, and as a series of artistic residences, and so on. What is particularly beautiful about his photos is how ruins and precarious buildings somehow find the way to become worthy main characters of his story. For a couple of years now, the 5 of us have been defining global strategies for this building complex, while at the same time designing together each of these buildings. Of course, this means an ever-changing state of design, with buildings in different phases influencing each other mutually. Besides, the long distance from our office means that a lot of these changes are happening quickly and without our presence, forcing us to adopt with flexible strategies, resistant to change and tolerant to mistakes. Okay, doesn't work very well. The first building we actually intervened upon were the old stables for sheep and pigs, which were to become the photo lab, a library, and workshop rooms. These were made of granites, precarious fragments of concrete masonry, a wooden structure, and a very old tile roof, with no architectural value. However, in the spirit of Tito Mora's photos, our strategy was to start from what existed, keeping everything we found, and building new layers inside it, playing with the same material logics we had already found on site, such as the concrete masonry very well adapts to the present local shortage of craftsmanship, or the painting of this beautiful wood structure that allowed us to repair it and give it a second life, or applying aluminium frames on top of this new wall to avoid complicated details and choosing colors from the catalog. Or else playing with the rough cast cement that is often found in the region to cover secondary gables or small unfinished structures, creating dignity and continuity among these walls and these small buildings, precarious structures that have been built over time, while remaining somehow anonymous and camouflaged in their own context. And here you can see some photos taken by the client and sent to us during the first workshop they did with the local people. Currently, we have moved to a second building where Tito's parents will live, and it is the renovation of an existing building which allowed the same logic of transformation, of course with the noble granite part, but also a precarious shed, which in this case had to be partially demolished to replace with some new walls. And to build a lightweight structure, reframing the courtyard between both parts, so the house and the shed, as to allow a new interior connection and a very open space. And here you can see some pictures of its current state sent to us by Tito via WhatsApp, who always keep us updated about the most recent advances, but also a print screen of the carpenter's Facebook page, who keeps everyone else up to date, usually adding a small caption with his own architectural criticism. And this one is another small building currently under construction, which will be Tito's temporary house. So once again, a single space following the same tectonic approach of the photo lab, with an infrastructural nucleus compacting a bathroom, a small kitchen, and some storage space. And the main difference in this one being the fact that in this case we finished the walls as the client found it was indispensable for a certain sense of domesticity. And you can see here both a digital drawing and a very quick collage produced by Francisco after one of our many site visits, which actually ended up, after so many changes, being almost all we needed as execution drawings, as actually to explain how we would only pick up ready-made elements that we found in the vast plots, like this metal column or beam, or fragments of the old gable to assemble a new structure. And once again, some WhatsApp pictures, as well as another print screen from our current favorite architectural critic. And here the main nobler building, which we will eventually reach one day. Another example of collaboration currently under construction. It is the extension of a rural house we have been designing once again with Rita and Dionisio. some close friends of ours who actually live very close to this construction site. And you can see the sort of new forms of expression that these collaborations and exchanges, which are often undertaken via Zoom or WhatsApp, can provide to the discipline. And here are some pictures of last week's construction sites. This is a very interesting project to us because the client insisted to start so quick that we didn't actually have the time to do an execution project. So this actually opened up space for on-site experimentation where decisions are being taken, like this cyclopean concrete wall, reusing the stones of a part we had to dismantle, or these concrete floors incorporating local cobbles. The next project is a house we recently completed in Paranhos, Porto, which we designed together with Francisco Craveiro. On typology, Rafael Moneo wrote that the most intense moments in architectural development are those when a new type appears. Often, he writes, external events, such as new techniques or changes in society, are responsible for impelling him toward his creation of a new type, in accordance with a dialectical relationship with history. As I previously explained, like in Barcelona, Portuguese cities have been experiencing an intense pressure due to mass tourism and gentrification, making it very difficult for locals to live in the city center. Due to this, a new type seems to be consolidating, consisting in the transformation of former garages and commercial ground floors into houses. Even though these spaces usually present uncanny layouts and proportions for a common apartment, their generosity and transversality actually offers a potential for alternative forms of living in the city. In this case, transforming the space of an old car repair shop into a home opened up new possibilities for the architecture of the house, assuming, of course, that it was not understood as such, as a house. If we dropped some of the images, precepts, and ways of living that we have inherited as modern conventions, to retrieve some others from the past which we have unfortunately lost. If we consider it as a fragment of the city, a house is nothing more than a shelter to protect its inhabitants from the elements, as well as to satisfy their most immediate physiological needs and guarantee the inconveniences of privacy. From this point of view, the existing space of the old garage was as strange as it was apt, and above all, it was generous enough in comparison to the increasingly minimal existence suggested by properties found on the market today. The program only required the space to be divided in two, between work, facing the street, and home, overlooking a small courtyard. The curve of this new wall accentuates the feeling of seclusion for those who now discover the house through a labyrinth. Besides, the project mostly consists of designing two wooden boxes inspired by the same medieval box beds we may find in the previous picture. The main facade was kept untouched, raising both confusion and curiosity regarding what lies beneath. Behind it, there is a century-old wooden door found and bought online, displayed from a typical Porto house to mark the new use of this former garage. Inside, an existing bathroom was refurbished and enclosed with a second-hand door also found online. The new bed boxes were made from local pine, MDF boards, and cork panels, all made visible. What you see is what you get. Sitting under the existing skylights, these boxes ensure a final layer of privacy and comfort for those living in this kind of camping ground, whose fire is symbolized by a new wood-burning stove. The intervention on the floor, walls, and ceilings was minimal. It consists mainly of thermal and acoustic insulation, once again, with exposed cork, as well as replacing the existing window frames to ensure proper energy efficiency. Painting both walls and floor was a request by the clients. And you can see that in-between spaces are not merely for circulation, but to their geometry and dimension always tend to be used as something else. The other box bed. as a shelter within a shelter. And each block has a different color, given by the standard pigmentation of both fire-resistant and water-resistant MDF, respectively. In addition to their practical usefulness, the design of these pieces of furniture suggests that it will be through a process of appropriation of objects collected over time that this open field will be transformed into a home. Proof of that is the new kitchen designed by Fala and brought into this garage as a sort of first ready-made. You see the fireplace and the garden yet to be finished, as it is so difficult to find people to work right now.
Well, the next project is set in a quite different landscape from the ones we previously seen. It's a weekend house in inland Portugal near the River Douro. The relationship with the river and the surrounding vegetation was precisely what led to the purchase of this plot after a long search for the right piece of land. When the clients bought the plot, there was a ruin already there and a study to build an extension of 300 square meters. From the very beginning, however, we proposed a much more restrained approach. Instead of a large extension, we suggested to simply add the missing infrastructures to the existing stone ruin. This model you see is from that initial study. After some time working on the project, the major forest fires that occurred in Portugal led to an expansion of the sensitive areas under ecological protection. On these plots, it became impossible to carry out any kind of extension, even the minimal one we had proposed. The ruin was too small, but the clients realized that there was a mismatch between the reality and the notary's document, which allowed us to slightly enlarge its imprint. We proposed to dismantle the existing house and simply rebuild it slightly larger with the same stones. But as it turns out, the move required a crane, which was too difficult and expensive to mount. We wanted to keep thinking of the project as a refurbishment, but our clients couldn't afford this move. At this moment, we could have decided to give up on the project as the clients didn't have the time or the money to redesign a new proposal. However, we remembered the words of the artist Lawrence Weiner to understand that our intents did not depend on the materials to be used. And like Weiner's sculpture, our task should be to find the most elementary description from which the project could be carried out by the receivers upon the occasion of receivership. In fact, what happened between design proposals was that the clients found a contractor who said he could build a house within their available budget. This meant using the most basic materials and construction techniques we had at hand. We were able to retain the overall form and topology of the house, a layering of rooms with different views, light conditions, and textures, but we had to adapt to the contractor's technical limitations. Decisions would have to be made together with them, not in advance, but directly on site, which has since become one of our favorite methods of work. And this was the result, once again, made from very cheap and ordinary materials, used as is, merely painted or varnished for protection in order to replicate the texture and the old granite interiors. Concrete blocks painted over, Portuguese pine wood, water-resistant MDF, standard window frames, exposed electrical circuits, and concrete screed floors. Quality of place arising mostly from the composition of those banal elements and different views over the landscape. About passages and turns, mirrors and windows, lots of them for natural cross ventilation. Set flush by the interior and painted red, intended to be mistaken by paintings. From the beginning, the whole process of design was very much discussed with the future inhabitants, who wished to sort of replicate an old vernacular family house they used to own not so far from this site. They described to us all these spaces, which were much more defined by their qualities than by their function, as they were used in a very loose and polyvalent fashion, according to how many people were in the house or the season of the year. Like these alcoves, which are very dark and have since become the favorite place for mid-afternoon naps. It was about understanding the uncanny comfort of granite stone. It was about seeing materials for what they were, the woodness of the wood and the sandiness of the sand. In one word, about the directness that Allison and Peter Smithson found on the way peasant architecture related to materials and to landscape. We tried to replicate all these different atmospheres of a stone hut with no artificial heating or ventilation. We decided to reconstruct the house as found, not only because this helped to go around the planning regulations that restricted new construction, but also because it forced to maintain this idea of the project as a refurbishment, to which we should only add new and more generous windows out to the landscape. We also asked the contractor to preserve all the stones so that we could use them to reconstruct exterior staircases and retaining walls, so the existing house still remains in place somehow. We also had to move the house to avoid a boulder which would be too expensive to remove, so we carved it to build an exterior staircase. And here is one of the most polemical gestures of the house, the fact that we decided to put the bathroom next to the main door, exposed by this huge window. The fact is that people spend a lot of time in the bathroom, taking care of oneself or simply reading in the toilet, so we believe it is an absurd to regard them as purely functional servant spaces. Even the truth is that since then, clients and their guests have sent us several photos demonstrating that they are happy with this result, even though the glazier who installed the windows accused us of being unethical. Anyhow, like in Buñuel's surrealist takes, we are convinced that a weekend home is a perfect excuse to put some bourgeois conventions to test. Probably because of its appearance, or perhaps due to our affinity with the work of Allison and Peter Smithson, this house has been described in some articles as brutalist. But even if the house was finally built in concrete, it was not never about a fascination on concrete, which we do not nurture. In fact, the association between brutalist and concrete is one of the greatest misconceptions in the history of architecture. As Banham pointed out, even the béton brut of Le Corbusier Unité d'Habitation, often seen as the inspiration for this movement, was itself an adaptation to the construction conditions of that time in France, since the building was originally intended to have a steel structure. On the contrary, it is a matter of attitude, as it was attested in the Sugden House. The Smithsons were clear that, for them, brutalist meant direct, even if for others it came to be a synonym for rough concrete. To be direct means to address the complexity of a banal request, the economic constraints, the aesthetic preferences of the clients, as well as conservative building regulations. All the reasons that forced them to abandon a first proposal with an inverted pitch roof, and to use inexpensive bricks, ordinary tiles, standard metal windows, all assembled in what they call an arty manner. Sometimes left exposed, sometimes not, as in a manner of defining different zones in this open floor living. Symmetry was not a requirement. Facades were composed with a standard window range to achieve various forms of framing of the exterior, of getting more sunlight and proper ventilation. It is an ordinary house, yet quite radical in its ordinariness. And the last house we will show you was to be situated in one of the last empty plots of a suburban allotment about 15 kilometers from Porto. However, the brief for this suburban house was not, as usually, for a conventional nuclear family. The couple who hired us had a more complex family life. He had a daughter, she had a son, both grown-ups and living somewhere else, but still coming for some periods of the year. Other relatives, such as the mother of his daughter, were coming for festivities and staying for a while. Besides, they were supposed to work from home and, in their free time, they enjoyed painting and sculpting. Those different layers of privacy and ambiguity between domestic and productive life made us think of another suburban house that Andrea Palladio designed for the Foscari brothers and their respective families. As Antonio Foscari wrote, it seems clear that a 16th century seigneurial house, both in an urban setting and in the countryside, would have contained quite a large community and a varied one, not only in relation to the tasks, responsibilities, and roles each individual member undertook, but also in terms of their age, sex, and social backgrounds. Perhaps this explains why Palladio ideally compared the house to a small city. A central space with different widths spanning from the main to the rear facade established the necessary distance for both living together and apart. Adjoining communication rooms varied in dimension and light, but their uses were not fixed for precise functions, as these had not yet been invented by modernism. Albeit hidden, staircases were paramount to mediate these nobler spaces both above and underneath. Contrary to the La Mala Contenta, however, our house was to be tucked in a narrow plot. Besides, during our first meeting with the clients, one of them made a sketch you can see on the left. He explained that he imagined the main spaces of the house as transversal, opening both to the street and to the garden. In the beginning, this request seemed a bit absurd because the plot was really narrow. But we soon realized that a straight diagonal staircase could not only make it possible, but actually make it more interesting. Along the way, we found out that the Japanese architect Itsuko Asegawa had already developed a series of studies for one of her houses about the kind of polyvalence of uses and the kind of distances that exploring this idea of transversality and the diagonal would create inside a small house. And we developed our initial sketch into a typological experiment, where the main space in the ground floor would be transversal, allowing for different kinds of light, views, and the proper ventilation. A studio next to it would allow temporary guests to have some autonomy. And in the upper floor, the staircase would unfold to allow for an extra layer of distance between both parents and their respective children. Here are some images of the main transversal space. Some high and low angles showing this ambiguity between being closed and apart inside the small house. And an axometric view showing the spatial implications of the staircase in the upper floor as well. And an exterior view of the main facade to be clad in cork and painted silver. The elements used to compose it would be quite economical. In the end, not so far from the client's first sketch. Unfortunately, this project will never be built, leaving this place to exist only in its imagined and built form.
The last two projects we will present are actually the smaller and the largest we have designed until now, but they are actually quite not so different. In a way, both are primitive huts, both with very different scales. Regardless of the source, the myth seems to associate the origin of architecture to humankind's need to shelter, protecting oneself from the elements, to gather and to domesticate the energy one relies upon. In Logier's version, it makes do with resources at hand, and their logical composition, with all their imperfections and functional requirements, would generate what we would come to recognize as classical forms. Besides, architecture itself, the female figure, seems to point another direction is possible for the young architects. So in this project, we were invited to design one of 8 architectural artworks for the Shape of Neighborhood Festival in Braga, as it was this year's Portuguese capital of culture, which was supposed to be installed in a community garden, in our case. These kind of working class community gardens have a long cultural history in France, where families used to build what they called Sunday pavilions to spend their free time, namely Portuguese immigrants. Primitive huts, which were particularly important as these community gardens are usually very exposed to the sun. Another cultural milestone that influenced our proposal was Aldo Rossi's Teatro del Mondo for the first Venice Biennale. Beyond the object itself, however, we were very interested in the text that Tafuri wrote about it, and even more, we were interested by its title, The Ephemeral is Eternal. The mobilization of so much energy, public funding, and human resources, we believed, would only make sense if our pavilion could become more than just an ephemeral backdrop for an extraordinary event of high culture. Expanding on the ideas behind Teatro del Mondo, this pavilion should demonstrate that even a piece of architecture designed and built with temporary means may aspire to eternity. The aim was to design a simple and economical structure, both conceptually and materially. A place of shade where people from both the garden and the neighborhood could gather, and where it could be up to them to continue its construction through use and appropriation. A triangle, a circle, and a square. A shed, sort of decorated by Aldo Rossi. Here you can see the garden, which has a very strong, almost Baroque relationship with the social housing blocks next to it. So we decided that this pavilion should be installed in the limit between them, belonging both to the garden and to the neighborhood. And here the pavilion as built and seen from the garden. As you can see, it is a very simple construction made from timber and corrugated sheet, like a movie set with a lightweight roof for shadow and rain protection. And the scenario facade acting as a meeting point for people in the neighborhood here in the official opening day. With a window/table connecting the garden to the pedestrian street on the other side. And here you can see it during the Pancake Day, which was organized by a German artist called Daniel Parnitzke, who built a self-made oven to produce on-site homemade cherry jam and pancakes, which were finally distributed for free through the window. And finally, you can see a picture of the pavilion appropriated in an ordinary day. And you can see that even if it's a very, very cheap construction, it can aspire to the same ambitions of such a monument like Alberti's. And here the pavilion pressured by the construction process ongoing, which make us unsure that even though the politics were open to it, it will stay much longer. So the last project we'll present to you is a bit larger than what we are used to do in the office. And the commission was to design sustainable new public building in Baião, a small town about an hour from Porto, to replace and enlarge the existing temporary structure you can see in the center of the image. It should operate as a marketplace, a fairground, an auditorium, a cafe, and so on. In fact, we at Atelier Local did it only because we were invited by our friends at Fala to do it with them. And we did it also because we found from the beginning in this project the potential to say no and to follow a different direction. Together, we agreed that the only way to do a sustainable polyvalent building would be to make no building at all. Very quickly, we decided that the ground they required was already there. And actually, they needed just a roof over their heads to protect all those activities from sun and rain. And so we started to discuss around images which were referential of this sort of very large huts we were imagining. Examples which were large enough to become truly public space, which means open 24/7 for all and for free. Besides, we realized that a roof of such dimension would offer us a suitable alternative to this sort of ecological contradiction we are currently experiencing in our landscapes, where in the name of ecology we have been devastating them in several new ways. So we decided that instead of building a new building, we would maintain the existing fairground as it was and just design an infrastructural module to sustain this roof. These modules would allow us not only to protect, but also to capture and domesticate the energy we need for the building to operate. An accordion roof to harvest water and sun, and a grid of columns to redistribute them in usable range to everyone using the new covered square, allowing for as many forms of appropriation as possible under this one single roof. And here you can see this new figure in the city, an autonomous geometric shape following the logic of its own construction process, but tilted to make the most of the free-form plot in which it was supposed to be built. Other than the roof, you can see a new stand, 2 small buildings for storage space and support infrastructure, as well as a new water tank for collecting rainwater. And a section where you can see the untouched ground with its current terraces and a tilted roof to follow the slope of the site and to convey rainwater for the new water tank. And here you can see a plan where you can see the roof's minimal footprint and how the small auxiliary buildings would have a scale approximate to the surrounding houses. And some images of the model where we can better understand the relationship between the hovering solar panels facing southeast and the skylights facing northeast. Here the water tank and the smaller buildings, as well as stand for concerts or simply for people to meet and rest. The virtual image of what it would look like in market days. You can see the perforated metal side flaps, which provide both an additional layer of shade as well as an expressive layer for the building, evocative of local folk art. And inside, during the annual local gastronomy festival, now open onto the landscape and not inside a tent, or during a concert by the local popular dance group. And you can see how lightweight this roof would feel with light entering homogeneously from the skylights. And a final image of the presence this non-building would have as a new productive field in the middle of the city, planned to be producing energy not only for its own consumption, but also for the new public housing under construction in the city of Baião. Unfortunately, as we were about to start the execution project, the mayor lost the elections, and so this will probably never get built. Let's hope otherwise. Thank you.
Obrigado, obrigadísimo. Bueno, no sé, comentario así un poco tonto, pero la verdad es que es heroico lo que está haciendo tanto Nuno Melo como vosotros desde la provincia, ¿no? Yo que vengo de la provincia sé lo difícil que es trabajar allá y no, es espectacular lo que están haciendo. Aparte de este comentario, ¿algún comentario vuestro, una pregunta del público? ¿No?
Yeah, so thank you very much for the lecture. It was really nice. Like, I really appreciate your view. And I wanted to ask you, like, because I feel like money has been like a central theme surrounding your work. And I would like to ask you for advice for young architects in order to like minimize cost in these kind of projects. Given like your experience.
do you want to start, or should I start?
Well, as you can see in our projects, one of the ways you can think about it is that the more efficient way, ecologically and money and economically talking, is to use the most of what exists already. I think we already talked a lot about this in other times. We talked with other architects, but if you want to be ecological and also economic reasons, if the best way to save money is to realize that to use what already exists is like the best way to achieve that goal. I think that's what we try to do in our projects.
Yes, and I think also what we try to insist a bit is that, like Robin Evans, he wrote a lot about that, and the ways we live today, they are not eternal. We haven't always lived like that, but we were used to inherit the ways of living and to assume them as universal and as the ones we should be living by. And from the very beginning, the fact that we had very little money, and I don't want this to be mistaken by like an apology or even an eulogy to austerity, on the contrary, but the fact that we had very little money made it easier for us to be able to convince people to put some of those preconceptions to test. So an advice I would give is that you should always of course, inherit things, but be very critical about them and to understand where you can tackle them so that maybe you can find new ways of making generous spaces with that very little money. For instance, we usually, it's sort of a joke, but whenever we receive a client for the first time, we ask them if they have any idea of how much a door costs. And of course, usually they don't. And we say it costs a lot, and we explain how much. And we say, you know, in a conventional house, maybe you have 10 or 15 doors, and maybe you don't need them all. So maybe we should start by removing the doors we don't need, and so on and so on. And we do that with the walls, and we do that with everything else. And so that's the only advice I would give. There is not a receipt, like something I can just say do this, but the attitude to be open to put things to test, to be critical about them, I think it's very, very useful when you have little money.
¿Una pregunta más? Bueno, si no, como sois todos muy tímidos, arriba va a haber unas cervecitas y les podéis preguntar en persona. Bueno, llegamos al Ecuador de Jamón Jamón. Hoy sería presunto. La semana que viene desde Andalucía DJ Arquitectura o DJ Arquitectura, no lo sé cómo se pronuncia, así que os esperamos dentro de la semana. Y arriba hay cervezas.